But, you know, today we have not really touched on Ukraine, and there seem to be major developments there. The Russian speakers are making big headway, and Europe is alarmed by this.
Full credit must go to the Russian government and to the Russian people who are supporting the government so massively, so convincingly. The Zionists have planned against Russia for centuries. For centuries they've been planning against Russia. The last major military effort on the part of the Zionists to emasculate Russia and reduce it into a third-rate country took place in the Crimean War from 1853 to 1855. For 2 years the war lasted. And Russia defended Crimea with heroism until eventually the Russians had to withdraw from Crimea, and the Western world celebrated their victory. And then in those days, it was a more civilized world. So I think it was Austria who then offered peace with Russia, and Russia accepted, and the conference took place in Paris. And it was called the Peace of Paris, where all the parties to the war sat down, and I guess drank champagne, and negotiated a peace treaty. And that peace treaty resulted in Russia having to accept the demilitarization of Crimea. Hence, Russia was not allowed to maintain a naval fleet and a naval port in Crimea. And therefore, the entire southern border of Russia on the Black Sea remained vulnerable to the Ottoman Empire, to France, Britain, and so on, were the naval powers. I think it was within 7 years of astute diplomacy on the part of Russia, and Russia was able to turn back that agreement and recover Crimea as a naval base. And Russia held on and has held on to Crimea as a naval base since then. The Western world then responded in 1917 with the Russian Jews bringing about the Bolshevik Revolution, and then installing communism in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union then doing all that they could do to destroy the religious foundation, Orthodox Christianity, killing the priests and destroying the churches and shutting down the monasteries. They did all that they could do until there was no more they could do. And the Christian church still survived. But then they came with the next plan, which was in 1954, when the Soviet Union transferred Crimea to Ukraine. Ukraine was a Soviet republic. And the Soviet Union transferred the territory of Crimea to Ukraine from Russia without the permission of the Russian people, without consultations with Russia, without the permission of the people of Crimea, without consultations with them. Why did the Soviet Union do that? Answer, there is only one honest answer. Only one honest answer. That the Soviet Union was acting on behalf of the Zionists. That's why the Soviet Union did it. After transferring Crimea to Ukraine, the next step in the ladder would be to eventually dismantle the Soviet Union, which they did in the 1980s, so that Ukraine will emerge as an independent state. which it did. And then the next step after that would be to try to get a pro-Western government in Ukraine, which they did with their street demonstrations. And then get Ukraine to become a member of NATO. And then Ukraine will tell Russia, get out of Crimea. We don't want you there. So what they could not do in the Crimean War, because Russia was able to rescind the Treaty of the Peace Paris within 7 years, they will now do through an independent Ukraine. It is to the credit of the Putin-led government in Russia, to their credit, that they were able to anticipate what was happening, because the demonstrations were going on for months in Ukraine, and they acted with great speed, brilliance, in doing what they did with Crimea. Within 2 weeks, the Western world was speechless. They were immobilized, politically immobilized. There was nothing they could do. And Russia took Crimea before their very eyes. This is, in my opinion, the most significant setback that the Zionist movement has ever experienced since its creation in 1897. The loss of Crimea to Russia. The reason why they don't want Russia to have Crimea is because they don't want a Russian fleet, naval fleet, to threaten Israel. That's right. It's all eschatology. And now they're provoking Russia in Ukraine, because in addition to the problem of the Russian fleet in Crimea, there is now the new threat because of BRICS. Russia, as I mentioned earlier, Russia is leading the way to create an alternative to the petrodollar monetary system. And if Russia succeeds, that's goodbye to Western dominance over the world. Okay? So you have to provoke Russia to eventually lead to a war with Russia that would provide an opportunity for the petrodollar monetary system to survive. The Russians have already won over Crimea, and they are showing great skill, brilliance in Ukraine. They allow the Ukrainian army to kill more than 2,000 Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. Kill. An army killing its own people. More than 2,000. If this had occurred in any other part of the world, the Western world would have been crying at the top of their voices, shouting, screaming. This is oppression. This is genocide. This is this and this is that, and calling for the United Nations, calling for intervention, all kind of things, no-fly zone or whatever. The way Canada is now barking like a dog over Ukraine, that's how they were barking like dogs over other parts of the world, Libya and Syria and so on. But Russia did not intervene. Russia held her hand so that the world would see the eastern Ukrainian people fighting for freedom from oppression, to see them back to the wall, and they're being killed by a superior force. Russia acted with great skill and brilliance in waiting and biding its time. And then Russia pulled off another stunt, which was absolutely beautiful, the humanitarian convoy. They love it, the Western world, these hypocrites. That we don't have to get a permission of a government to send in a humanitarian convoy. No, we don't need your permission. Human rights prevail over rights of the state. Well, I lived to see the day when Russia did the same thing. And Russia said, well, we don't need the Ukrainian government permission. We asked for it, we didn't get it. We're moving in. We're going to do what you did in Syria. It was brilliant. And once we do it the first time, we could do it any more time we want. The Western world is not prepared to respond militarily over an issue where they would lose public opinion. No, not a humanitarian convoy. And now look at southern Ukraine. In order to divert the fighting from that area where the Ukrainian army is gaining the upper hand, what they did was to open another front on the south, which potentially leaves of greater strategic danger to Ukraine, because it opens a land route between Russia and Crimea. And once Russia takes that land route, there's no way that Ukraine can ever get it back. Ukraine will then become a landlocked country. So this was a brilliant move. And when the Western world, again with their typical hypocrisy, protesting that Russia has invaded Ukraine and Russian soldiers are in Ukraine, listen to the Russian ambassador at the UN, as though the words were on a gramophone record, tape recorder. Exactly what they were saying, he then said, no. These are retired Russian military officers. And these are people who are on leave from their jobs. These are not active Russian soldiers. Exactly the same thing that they were doing. And now they are protesting because Russia is doing the same thing. In the Quran, Allah says, "Jazā'u sayyi'a sayyi'atun mithlaha." That the punishment that is befitting for an evil deed is a punishment that is commensurate to the deed. So we say to Canada what the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago once said when his opponents were shouting too hard, loudly, using all kind of violent language. The Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, said, which is what we now say to Canada, let the dogs bark. Let the dogs bark. Give them the time to bark. That's all they're doing, barking. What Canada is saying, and the Canadian protests, have absolutely no significance at all. Zero significance. Putin is winning the game in Crimea, or won the game in Crimea. He's winning the game in Ukraine. And for the first time ever, the Zionists are finding themselves facing a force that is able to deal with them and outmaneuver them. And so credit to Putin and credit to Russia.